So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. So my name is Jarrod Doherty. I am heading up the player behavior efforts at Blizzard as a part of a team called Player Behavior Insights. I am also part of the Fair Play Alliance as one of their steering committee members. We had a really cool summit yesterday. If you're really interested in player behavior topics, please check out some of those sessions. They're really cool. So let me tell you a little bit about what Player Behavior Insights is at Blizzard. And so at Blizzard, our mission as Player Behavior Insights is to champion our core value of play nice, play fair. And we do this over 3 areas. So the 3 areas are we want to minimize the prevalence and impact of negative player behaviors through accurate detection, more effective penalization, and by incentivizing positive player behaviors through data-informed feature designs in our games. So there's some hard questions around player behavior in games, and I'm sure you've either heard these questions from stakeholders or game teams or even had them yourself. So questions like, hey, are we doing enough about player toxicity in our games? Is toxicity hurting our games? And this is actually a really difficult question to answer from an analytics perspective. And as an aside, while I'm up here on my soapbox, I'm going to say that I really dislike the word toxicity. Just because from our data, we see that significantly less than 1% of players are what we'd consider consistently disruptive, which is probably how most people would traditionally define a toxic player. So it's a really, really, really small slice of the population. And it's also ambiguous. Like if you asked probably 10 people what a toxic player is, you'd probably get 10 pretty different responses to that. So we actually really much prefer the term disruptive player because disruption isn't as subjective, it's more clearly defined, and it applies to the actual players that you're trying to target with a lot of these efforts. So while it was 2018 Oxford Dictionary's word of the year, we don't like using it at Blizzard. We don't feel it's as accurate. So getting to the point where you can answer some of these questions around like disruptive player behaviors and impacts that they're having in your game is a little bit like a chicken and the egg conversation. Because to truly understand what's happening in your games, you need to invest in technology and teams to really study these things to determine if it's worth investing in building technology and teams to deal with these efforts. So it's very much kind of like a chicken and the egg argument. Luckily at Blizzard, we had lots of support just because this was a way to improve the player experience. It's one of our core values through play nice, play fair. But my team, of course, wanted to circle back and make sure, are we having the impact that we desired? How big is that impact? How can we prioritize future work? So understanding what's actually happening in our ecosystems was really important for us. So today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approach this. What was our journey at Blizzard? I'll walk you through kind of, as a player behavior insights group, where did we start? What did we look at? Show you some of the insights that we developed as we kind of progressed in our maturity. And then talk to you about like the methods and more advanced systems that we put in place, and then share a little bit about the impact that we saw in our Blizzard franchises. So before I get through like the crawl, walk, run approach, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork, make sure that we're kind of using the same terms and same understandings of some of these systems around like player reports and player behavior. So one of the first things that we did at Blizzard was kind of just take a step back and say, like, what are all the disruptive behaviors that can happen in our games? And so they kind of fell into 2 major categories, communication versus gameplay. And then of course within those, obviously, there's a bunch of subcategories. Along communication, there's game relevant disruption. There's more cyberbullying or off-topic disruption that happens. From a gameplay perspective, we've got abusive game mechanics, as well as like cheating, things that are enabled by tools and systems outside of the game. So for this talk, we're going to be mainly focusing on the left side, all around like the ways that players can be disruptive through communication channels. And one of the reasons that we started there is there's a lot of industry-wide data that supports that this is a growing issue among the people who enjoy our games. So this is all Pew Research data from 2017, and it covers the entire kind of online industry, so social media, games, everything. And so what they saw was that 72% of American internet users have witnessed online harassment or abuse. 62% of Americans consider online harassment to be a major problem. 47% of Americans have personally experienced harassing behaviors online. 18% of Americans have experienced particularly severe forms of harassment. So these are things like stalking, physical threats, sexual harassment, or harassment over a sustained period of time, like stalking. 20% of the people who responded to that previous question said that they eventually shut down or stopped using the service where this occurred. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this could be having a material impact to the success of your game and your communities. So as we start looking at the analytics around this topic, there's some pretty available typical data that you can use to kind of get started. So things like, what are the active users? How many people are actually using your platform or your game at any given time? Within that, you've got a subsection, which is complaints or player reports. And then you've got the category of those things. There's different categories of reports. You can see the distribution of those things. Then from within complaints, you can see, OK, how many of those complaints are actually leading to penalties via our policies? You can then see how many of those penalties that we gave out led to appeals. How many players didn't agree with the action that you took? And then from those appeals, how many of those did you agree that you didn't take the right action? How many of those did you overturn? Next topic for groundwork is just what is the anatomy of a typical player report system? And I'm sure any of you who've kind of worked on some of these meta systems, this will probably look pretty familiar. You get player reports. You have some sort of an evaluation threshold. For this example, it's just basically a linear X number of unique player reports over a certain period of time. From there, you apply some sort of account restriction, whether that's a silence, a suspension, or a ban. And there's some pros and cons to this system. So some of the major pros is that you're leveraging player agreement, which is a substitute for individual report confidence. You don't know when you receive a player report, how accurate is that? Is that a false report? Is it a true report? You don't really know. But you can leverage some player agreement to say, well, enough separate, unique players agreed that something was happening here. So we have a higher level of confidence that that behavior was occurring. It is easy to adjust. You can look at a lot of metrics around this and tweak that threshold over time to target different groups. And you can also penalize players in categories where you may not have a full capability to gather evidence. So things like voice abuse or gameplay sabotage, where you're not able to record exactly what's happening, but this lets you leverage player agreement to solve some of that. That being said, there's a lot of cons to this as well. So threshold, target, and period must be set pretty high to avoid gaming the system, abuse of the system, false positives. And this leads to a lot of false negatives, right? Because if you're setting these thresholds really high, you may have players who don't play all that much, but when they do play, they're being abusive or harassing, and you're just not going to catch them with a higher threshold. It can also lead to false positives at high levels of engagement. So if you have very popular streamers or people who play your game a lot, like significantly higher than the average, they may just hit this threshold as a function of time, like accumulating false reports or just players who are unhappy with their performance and reported them for invalid reasons. At high levels of engagement, you can get those false positives. There's also low penalization effectiveness due to certainty and swiftness. So it takes a lot of reports over a lot of time. And for the player who eventually gets penalized, they're like, well, I've been doing this for a long time, and this is the first time you've complained. I don't understand what the big deal is. And then you can have very limited evidence to support the actions that you've done. So if you're leveraging player agreement very heavily, that's not always a reason that resonates with the players. So we've set the groundwork. Let's kind of look at the crawl phase. So knowing that you've got this easily available data, what are some of the things you can work towards, some of the things you can look at that can help inform the design of your game? So one of the simplest things is just looking at trends. So in this graph, this is all example data, but the blue line is just the absolute number of reports that you're getting on any given day over time. And then the green line is the percent of players that are being penalized. So basically going back to that funnel diagram, the relationship between the two layers. And so you can see that if you're just looking at the absolute number, you've got these like spikes, and those are happening on the weekends. But if you look at the percent of active users to players who've been penalized, you can see that there's actually a small dip on the weekend. So that's being driven by, you've got more players playing on the weekend, but a smaller percent of those players are actually being penalized. And you can do this relationship with all layers of that funnel. So you can look at, okay, what are the relationship between the penalties that we're getting, the appeals that we're getting, the overturns that we're doing, and keeping an eye on those relationships can be really beneficial. One of the next things you can look at is report distributions. So you can see, okay, at each threshold level of our system, what is the total number of players that we are penalizing? And then what is the report volume that is like taking into account? So the example being is, if you've got players who are more disruptive than others, they may be contributing a higher percentage of the overall report volume. So you can look at this and basically optimize your system to find, okay, what is kind of like the biggest difference between these two lines? What is the biggest bang for our buck in terms of, we're penalizing the least number of players for the highest impact? And so to give you a quick example of some of the insights that we at Blizzard have kind of come to with some of this data, we see that in terms of report distributions, we saw that the kind of worst 1% of our reported players actually contributed more than 25% of total report volume. So we had this very, very tiny slice of our player base contributing a huge number of just the report volumes. They were disrupting the experiences of a lot of other players. We were also able to just analyze our reporting thresholds and see, hey, are we actually targeting the right groups of players? Like, can we adjust these more intelligently so that we're more targeted in our efforts? And so what that led to is actually just more intelligent thresholds, things that we could dynamically look at, like heat mapping and say, like, is the period right? Is the threshold right? And get much more targeted on that and make sure that we were targeting the right players. Another thing you can look at with this commonly available data is just penalty effectiveness. So we look at like the reoffense rate or recidivism to see, okay, if we warn a player, what percentage of those players then go on to get a penalty? Players who get a first penalty, how many of those over a period of time go on to get a second penalty? And so what you'll want to see is that as that penalty escalation increases, you want that recidivism rate to go down. You want lower numbers of players reoffending at each layer. So in this example, you can see that at a warning, we have a pretty high level of reoffense, but then at the first penalty, that's much lower, and then at the second penalty, it's even lower still. But what you may find is that when we start looking at a third penalty, wow, our reoffense rate went way up again, and that may be because you're kind of overusing the same type of penalization. So at the, for example, if the first, second, and third penalties are all silences, in the first silence, maybe it was really short. Some people got the message, some didn't. Okay, now you're on to like a 3-day silence. More people got the message. But then, now you're on a 7-day silence or 14-day silence, and you're clearly not reaching the players who a silence had no effect on their behavior. And so this is a good indicator that, okay, maybe we need to try a different form of penalization once we reach this level of escalation. And so looking at Blizzard and some of the insights that we saw around this data, we saw that reoffense rates for Blizzard games was between 35 and 50%, depending on region, depending on franchise, depending on escalation of penalty. So what we did is we did a lot of A/B testing around penalty severity, penalty type, the duration of these penalties, so that we could really tune and maximize for that reoffense rate while keeping retention in mind too. Because we see if we penalize someone too swiftly and they quit playing the game altogether, we don't want that either. We also use this data to understand some of the impact of our player feedback messaging. So when we warned players that they were approaching a penalty, did that have an effect? As we were giving out thank yous, did that help some of the effects across the board in terms of allowing players to better understand what was happening in our systems? And the answer there was yes. We also looked at a lot of qualitative data. So we were kind of measuring some of this quantitative data, but there was definitely some questions there that we wanted some help answering. So we did a lot of player surveys, asking questions like, how often do you feel that you encounter disruptive behavior from other players? How often do you use the reporting system? How do disruptive behaviors impact your enjoyment of the game? And then how effective do you feel that the player reporting systems are? And obviously, you want to be careful with how you use qualitative data, but it can be valuable for prioritizing your efforts and understanding, from a player perspective, where can we have the biggest impact? It's also a good check on your quantitative data. So if you're able to measure some of these things directly and player perceptions aren't matching with what you're seeing in your data, you may have an education issue or a feedback issue. And so being more transparent to your players may have their perception more closely match reality. That being said, we talked about a lot of cool insights you can drive through this data, but there's some big shortfalls that I want to talk about. So there's some fundamental questions here that we still can't answer with the data set we've already talked about. So questions like, what is the accuracy of an individual player report? Can't answer that yet. At what rate are players reporting disruptive behaviors when they occur? Again, we can't answer this question. There's a lot of true system performance measurements that we can't answer. Things like, what percent of our daily matches are containing these behaviors? What percentage of our daily users are being disruptive? How often do disruptive behaviors get reported when they occur? How did X feature improve player behavior? And then the biggest one, how are disruptive behaviors impacting engagement and retention? Can't answer any of these questions yet. You can also see some really weird results. So this is not real data, but it's based on a true story. When you look at engagement with reporting systems as defined as either giving a report or receiving a report, you notice a very interesting and strong correlation to engagement and monetization from these players. And so you could look at that data and say, well, clearly, we need more disruption and abusive players driving engagement with the reporting system to maximize monetization and engagement. And obviously, no, that's a really bad conclusion to draw. But you can see how a naive analysis of this situation could lead to that really dangerous result. You can also see some really weird results around some of the efforts that you're taking. So let's say you wanted to implement player feedback messages to have your players trust the report system better. Or you wanted to improve the user experience of your reporting system to make it more discoverable, easier to use, easier to find. If the only thing that you're measuring is report volume, you're going to see a situation like this blue line where all of a sudden you've got this spike on when you launch the feature, and you're like, well, did that actually do what we wanted it to do? Like, it doesn't look right, and it would be expected. You can explain that spike, but in terms of answering the question of did it do what we wanted it to do, doesn't answer that question. The second example with the green line is a state where you did nothing. You've got no feedback going to players. They're getting really apathetic. They don't think the reports do anything, so they're just not reporting as often. And just over time, you're seeing just the apathy manifest as a reduction in the number of reports and penalties that you're giving out over time. And so if you're only looking at this metric, you may say, wow, we're doing an awesome job. Like, this is really good. These disruptive behaviors in our game are going down over time. We're killing it, when that's not the case. So on to the next step. How do you go from here? How do you start answering some of these fundamental questions and getting deeper insights into player behavior? So one of the important next steps is to find your ground truth. Understand, OK, let's look at either machine learning or some other solution, but we have to have a data set that we can test these solutions against and understand if we're comfortable with the results. So what we did is we created a golden data set of human-labeled examples to evaluate solutions against. We started with around 10,000 to 20,000 examples for every language. You can certainly use less, but the more labels you have, the better evaluation you're going to get. You can also use something like Mechanical Turk, for example, which has pros of low cost, it's fast, but it has some significant cons as well, where it may not reflect your company or community values. So for that, Blizzard, we ultimately decided to label our own data using our awesome game masters because they had a really good understanding of both our company values and our community values. So they're also a global workforce made up of 32 different nationalities and support 11 different languages. So this allowed us to really think globally and develop an internal tool where we could leverage all of their expertise. So from here, you want to evaluate solutions, and this goes equally for if you want to start developing your own. So some things to keep in mind here is that false positives are expensive in this space. So in terms of just player trust in your games, false positives really damage that. Same thing with just like your brand or community reputation, really damaging there. But there's also a real cost to this, right? If you're doing false positives and you're getting a lot of appeals and having to process those appeal tickets, that's man hours that could be better spent elsewhere. There's also some common challenges with off-the-shelf solutions. So as we were evaluating some of these, we ran into some concerns. So oftentimes, like in-game communications are typically truncated or poorly spelled, and so a lot of off-the-shelf solutions didn't really handle that well. And we also contain a large amount of game or genre-specific language that these off-the-shelf models may not be specifically trained for. There's often multiple languages within the same match or even the same line of text within some of our games. And obviously, they're poor at evaluating overall context. So the simple example is, F yeah, that was awesome, we killed that raid boss, could look very similar to, F you, you're horrible, I didn't like what you did. And so we wanted to make sure that our solution was able to understand the difference between those two things based on context. So ultimately, we ended up creating our own that we use. Ryan Brackney, who is one of my coworkers on my team, did a really great talk around how we specifically developed this algorithm, some of the architectures we used. But unfortunately, unless you have a time machine, that talk already happened yesterday. But it is on the vault. Please go check it out if you're interested in learning more about how to make your own solution around machine learning. So once you have kind of developed this solution either yourself or partnered with a external vendor or solution provider to have a better understanding of what's actually happening, you kind of unlock some hidden knowledge here. You have this new capability that you can leverage to start answering some of these questions around, what is the percent of daily matches that are being disruptive? What percentage of users are disruptive? How often do these things happen? And then did specific features have the positive impact you were looking for? So a quick example of some of the metrics and KPIs that we look at Blizzard. Things like, what is the percent of daily matches that contain disruptive behavior? So obviously, now that we have more confidence over what's happening in any individual match, we can report on this with much more granularity. Same thing with percent of daily active users who are being disruptive. And this is a really important thing to keep in mind, is that there's a difference between matches and players, because as you improve your report systems, you're going to be actioning some of these disruptive players much more quickly. And so they're going to have less of an impact in terms of disruption volume when you hit them. So looking at the relationship between these two things can help inform you, do we invest in better detection, or do we invest in making our solutions quicker so that we can action these players faster? The third thing we look at is a metric that is kind of related to player trust, but it's basically what percent of daily disruptive behavior actually gets reported by our players. And so this is really important to understand how our players are kind of viewing this behavior as it occurs. Do they feel that the reporting system is actually effective? Because if they don't think a report does anything, they're not going to report behavior when they see it. So this is something that we want to see increasing over time. You can also do much deeper dives and more complex analysis. So one of the things that we did at Blizzard that I want to share with everyone is basically an impact analysis. So how do these disruptive behaviors actually impact player engagement? When they encounter these behaviors over time, are they more likely to stop playing our games? Something that was really important to us. So what we did is we built a model that could predict an individual player's propensity to quit playing the game or churn out. We refitted this model daily. We made sure that it was only capturing the most important trends while ignoring irrelevant trends, things such as like events, seasonal cycles, et cetera. And so here's some of that data that we found. So I don't know if you can see all the labels there, but basically what we're looking at is on the left of the graph, that is a subset of players who have experienced no disruptive behaviors. And then all the way to the right of the graph is players who've experienced up to like 30% of their daily activity with disruption. And then on the vertical axis, you've got, well, what is their propensity to churn? Or what is our predicted value of their likelihood to quit playing the game? And you can see that globally, across all players in Overwatch, there was a 55% increase in their propensity to quit playing the game between 0% of exposure and 30% of exposure. So the takeaway there is that higher levels of exposure to abusive chat is strongly associated with lower retention rates. Next, we took this data and we sliced it by a lot of segmentations around just the age of the account and the current levels of engagement. We wanted to see, was this effect universal, or were certain segmentations of our players more sensitive to this effect than others? And so left to right is age of account, both newer to older, and then top to bottom is engagement lower to higher. And you can see, and actually it was a bit of a surprising result to us, was that the abusive chat effect was the largest for our most engaged players. So we kind of thought, these are the players who are already playing a lot. They're deeply entrenched in the game. They're not going to be as sensitive to this effect. But what we found is they were actually the most sensitive to this effect. We also noticed that kind of the slope of this line, this relationship between experiencing the behaviors and having a higher propensity to churn, was consistent across every single segmentation. So this was a relationship that held everywhere. And you can see that in that bottom row, we had some effect sizes as high as 400% increases in the propensity to churn among these most engaged players. So how do we run? How do we really use some of these insights and some of this data to build features, improve systems? So one of the biggest things that we were able to do at Blizzard is use machine learning systems to empower our player reports. So some of you may be thinking, well, OK, you've got this model. You can clearly look at any individual match and figure out, like, did something disruptive occur? And we think that's a bad idea for several reasons. So one of them is that we wanted to avoid being too heavy-handed and asserting purely our own values. We wanted to make sure that the community values and the community voice was reflected in what we were doing in terms of penalization. So even with the best metadata possible, intent can also be really difficult to detect. So the way you interact with, like, a group of really close friends, you're playing with 5 of your really close friends, you're in a match of Overwatch, the way you communicate is informed by a lot of context outside of the game that we would have no way of understanding. And that's going to be very different to how you communicate in a public space. So we wanted to make sure that we were kind of leaning on players to help us understand that context. Additionally, there is a cost to false positives. And what we saw is that the player report was a very important and very effective kind of pre-filtering. So this, of course, emphasized the need to monitor and improve player trust to encourage players to do more accurate reports. And that's where we did a lot of feedback messaging, being more transparent about what was actually happening to help improve that experience for players and trust the system more so that they would do more reporting. So now, because machine learning helps remove a large part of the uncertainty around individual player reports, we can now treat them differently. So for example, you get a player report, the machine learning algorithm agrees with that report, you now have a much higher confidence in that individual report and can treat it differently. So for example, if you have these verified reports, you can have a significantly lower threshold for taking an action because you trust those reports more. It also allows you to basically allow any player in your ecosystem to be like a trusted super reporter because your algorithm is helping to inform the confidence in their reports. So you'll also want to consider keeping that second threshold as like a backstop. So obviously, algorithms are trained for specific behaviors. They can be really good at learning from what's happening, but there can be new emergent behaviors that you're not specifically looking for. And so you want to keep that backstop to make sure that you're catching things that you're not specifically looking for. And then in terms of cadence, clearly you need to match this to your technology stack and your capabilities, but faster is better. But that's not to say that doing this on a manual basis, like on a weekly or daily basis or a more automated batch process, can still be really effective. But you do want to kind of start engineering and working towards a more real-time solution. Another benefit of this approach is that it lets you to better detect abuses of the system. So you can look at individual players and see that, over time, they're not putting in a lot of valid reports. There's a lot of reports that they're putting in that the algorithm is not agreeing with. It can help you detect some of those abuses. So one of the other ways, like I said, we kind of talked about in-game feedback because driving players to report more often and more accurately is really important to the system. We started thanking players for their reports when they led to an action. So they would get this message, it would pop up when they logged in, and we got a lot of really good feedback from players saying, this feels really good, and this lets me know that my report was valuable to Blizzard and had an impact. Another thing that we did, we started warning players. So we said, hey, you're starting to collect some verified reports, or you're starting to approach a threshold for unverified reports. And so we let them know, like, this is specifically kind of the behavior that we've seen you doing. It's out of line with the rest of the players. Cut it out. And we actually saw some really good results from that as well in terms of players who were getting that warning not going on to get that first penalty. If you want to learn a lot more about the social features, these feedback things that we did, that's enough to fill up an entire talk, which is what we did. So Natasha Miller, another coworker of mine, will be doing a talk specifically around social systems, design, implementation, and Overwatch later today. So there's the info for that. Highly recommend you check out that talk. And then I'm sure a lot of you are interested in, well, what have the results been? So as we've kind of implemented these better machine learning systems and implemented some of these social features and feedback systems, we've seen some really amazing results, like far exceeding our own expectations in terms of the impact that we'd have. So 43% reduction in Overwatch in terms of the matches with disruptive behavior since we started this program. I mean, that's huge. I think had we pitched that number in the beginning, no one would have believed us. We also saw a 2,100% increase in the just accuracy of our penalties based on players agreeing with that penalty and appealing that ticket. We also saw around a 70% decrease in the time it took us to penalize some of these disruptive behaviors, which had a really big impact on, well, what is the total impact they can have against our communities? We also saw around a 60% reduction in the reoffense rate across the board. And we also saw a 173% increase in the trust that our players had in the reporting system. And that was informed by both quantitative data and qualitative data. And so you may be thinking, well, this sounds really cool. Let's build a machine learning system. Let's implement it. One shot, one kill, right? Not quite. So there's also some caveats here where this has to be an ongoing process. Language and slang changes and shifts over time, especially in gaming communities. You will also run into adversarial players, so players who say, there's this reporting and penalization system, like I want to mess with that. I want to try and abuse it. I want to figure out how it works, and I want to try and get around it. So you're going to have some adversarial players that you'll have to maintain and upkeep your systems to fight against. And you also need to do ongoing active learning, so retraining your models, understanding these shifts and these changes and how behaviors are changing over time. And so here is just a super simplified version of kind of what active learning means in this context. Like I said earlier, Ryan's talk goes into a lot more detail about how you can actually engineer an active learning loop. But basically, the TLDR of this is that you have your behavior detection classifier. You look at text selection, say, OK, what is confusing the algorithm? What isn't exactly making sense to us? And then looking at your appeals pipeline and understanding, OK, what are the ones where a human looked at it, agreed that maybe we didn't take the right action? Let's feed that back into a training system. From there, we kick it back over to human labelers. So we have an ongoing process where they're reviewing some of these things where the algorithm was confused or there was appeals that happened, and they relabel that data, which can then be added to the system. From there, we update the model, we redeploy it, and we go through this process continuously. So conclusions and takeaways. So these are the things that I would really like that you leave this room with. So there's certain questions you can't definitively answer with traditional data. So there's certain things that you'll never be able to answer either for your own benefit or your stakeholders' benefits, just using what's probably traditionally available in your ecosystem. And you need to invest in solutions to kind of understand deeper what's happening. We also saw that higher levels of exposure to abusive chat is strongly associated with lower retention rates across all players. And that the abusive chat effect was largest for our most engaged players, which was a really important takeaway for us. You also need to invest in building player behavior capability for finding your ground truth and generating true actionable KPIs that make sense for your use cases. And to ensure long-term success, you need a dedicated team or partner that's going to build, support, and actively update these solutions over time. All right, so thanks for coming. That's the end of the content. I'm not going to be doing any formal questions, but I'll be hanging out up here if you want to come up and talk to me more. And please complete your speaker surveys from GDC. Thank you.